Sometimes a man loses everything before he discovers what he's truly made of. Ray Delaney had just buried his wife, lost his job, and watched his family slip away from him piece by piece. When his estranged grandfather left him a broken-down ranch in the middle of nowhere, Arizona, his own brother laughed at him. "You're taking the kids to live in that dump? That place isn't worth the gas money to drive out there." But Ray saw something different in that old ranch. He saw a chance to rebuild. His teenage kids thought he'd lost his mind, moving them away from everything they knew. The land looked worthless, the house was falling apart, and the whole place seemed cursed by decades of neglect. Everyone told Ray he was chasing a fool's dream. What they didn't know was that his grandfather had left behind more than just dirt and memories. Hidden beneath that barren ground was a secret worth $300 million. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The unemployment notice crumpled in Ray Delaney's back pocket felt like a death sentence as he drove the dusty two-lane highway toward what remained of his inheritance. 3 months had passed since Sarah's funeral, and the silence in their beat-up Honda Civic was thick enough to cut with a knife. His 16-year-old daughter, Emma, stared out the passenger window with the kind of resentment that only comes from having your life torn apart by circumstances beyond your control. In the back seat, 12-year-old Marcus had given up asking, "Are we there yet?" Somewhere around the third hour of desert landscape, Ray's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he caught Emma's reflection in the side mirror. She had her mother's eyes, deep brown and expressive, but right now they held nothing but accusation. He couldn't blame her. 6 months ago, they'd lived in a modest but comfortable house in Phoenix. Sarah had been alive, working her job at the elementary school she loved, and Ray had been pulling decent money as a senior mechanic at Henderson's auto shop. The kids had friends. Emma was on the debate team, and Marcus played Little League baseball every weekend. Then cancer came calling. The medical bills started small, co-pays and deductibles that seemed manageable. But as Sarah's condition worsened and the treatments became more aggressive, their savings evaporated like water in this godforsaken desert heat. Ray took every overtime hour available, worked weekends, even picked up side jobs, fixing neighbors' cars in their driveway. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. When Henderson's downsized and Ray's position got cut, he'd tried to convince himself. It was temporary, just a rough patch. He'd find something else, but weeks turned into months, and the rejections piled up like autumn leaves. Too old, they said, overqualified for entry-level positions, underqualified for management. At 42, Ray Delaney had become invisible in a job market that worshipped youth and credentials he'd never had time to earn. The ranch appeared on the horizon like a mirage, or maybe a punishment. Ray had only been there once as a child, maybe 8 years old, visiting his grandfather Samuel during one of his rare attempts at family reconciliation. He remembered a stern man with weathered hands who spoke little and expected children to be seen and not heard. The visit had lasted exactly 3 days before Ray's father declared it a waste of time and drove them back to their life in Tucson. Samuel Delaney had been a mystery to his family, a man who'd bought land in the middle of nowhere and lived alone for 40 years, sending birthday cards with crisp $20 bills, but never calling, never visiting. When Ray's father died 10 years ago, Samuel hadn't even attended the funeral. The family wrote him off as an eccentric old coot who'd probably leave his money to some charity, or maybe the stray cats that supposedly wandered his property. The letter from Samuel's attorney had arrived 3 weeks after Sarah's funeral, delivered by certified mail, while Ray sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by past due notices and sympathy casseroles from neighbors who didn't know what else to do. The inheritance was simple: 640 acres of high desert land, a ranch house built in 1952, and various outbuildings in as-is condition. No money, no stocks, no bank accounts, Just dirt and whatever structures hadn't collapsed under 4 decades of neglect. Ray's brother Mike had laughed until tears ran down his cheeks when Ray mentioned the possibility of moving there. Jesus, Ray, the old man probably died owing more in back taxes than that place is worth. You'd be better off selling it to some developer and splitting the proceeds, if anyone's stupid enough to buy it. But Ray had seen something in that letter. Between the legal jargon and property descriptions, a sentence that stuck with him. Samuel Delaney expressed his specific wish that this inheritance pass to Raymond Delaney, whom he believed would understand the true value of the land and its possibilities. The attorney couldn't explain what Samuel meant by that, but something about those words resonated with Ray. After months of feeling powerless and useless, here was someone who believed he might understand something valuable. The Honda's engine coughed as they turned off the main highway onto a dirt road marked only by a weathered wooden sign, Delaney Ranch, private property. Emma looked up from her phone with alarm. "Dad, please tell me this isn't our street. It's our road now," Ray replied, trying to inject some optimism into his voice. Marcus leaned forward between the seats. "How much farther?" "About 2 miles. According to the directions, the road was little more than 2 tire tracks with a strip of desert grass growing down the middle. Dust billowed behind them as they bounced over ruts and rocks, the Honda's aging suspension protesting with every bump. Saguaro cacti stood like ancient sentries on either side, their arms raised in what looked like permanent surrender to the relentless Arizona sun. When the ranch house finally came into view, Emma actually gasped. The structure looked like it had been fighting a losing battle with the elements for decades. What had once been white paint now hung in peeling strips from weathered wooden siding. The front porch sagged at one corner where a support beam had given way, and several windows were boarded up with plywood that had warped and split in the heat. The roof showed patches where shingles had blown away, leaving dark spots that promised leaks when the rains came. Ray parked near what used to be a front gate, though the fence had collapsed in so many places it was more suggestion than barrier. As they climbed out of the car, the silence was overwhelming. No traffic, no neighbors' lawnmowers, no sounds of civilization at all. Just wind through the scrub brush and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. "This is it?" Marcus asked, his voice small in the vastness. "This is home," Ray said, shouldering his duffel bag and walking toward the front door. Emma followed reluctantly, stepping carefully around loose boards and rusty nails. "Dad, I don't think this place is even habitable. Look at it." She had a point. Up close, the damage was even worse. The front steps were cracked concrete, and the screen door hung at an angle, its mesh torn and flapping in the breeze. But Ray had been fixing broken things his whole life. Engines, transmissions, relationships. Okay, maybe he wasn't so good at the last one, but houses were just bigger machines with different parts. The front door key turned easily enough, though Ray had to put his shoulder into opening the warped door. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight streaming through gaps in the boarded windows. The air smelled of must and time, with undertones of something Ray couldn't quite identify. Leather, maybe, or old wood polish. The living room was sparse but not empty. A leather couch sat facing a stone fireplace, its surface cracked but still sturdy. Built-in bookshelves lined one wall, still filled with volumes on subjects Ray wouldn't have expected. Geology, mining engineering, military, history. A roll-top desk occupied the corner near the window, its surface covered with a dusty sheet. "At least the roof didn't fall in," Marcus offered, ever the optimist. Emma ran her finger along the mantelpiece, collecting enough dust to write her name. In it, "Dad, seriously, we can't live here. There's probably no electricity, no running water." "Actually," Ray interrupted, flipping a wall switch. A ceiling fan overhead groaned to life, wobbling slightly, but functioning. "Looks like Samuel kept the utilities connected." They explored the rest of the house room by room. The kitchen was dated but functional, with an old gas range and a refrigerator that hummed when Ray plugged it in. 3 bedrooms branched off a central hallway, each furnished with the basics: bed, dresser, nightstand. Nothing fancy, but clean under the dust. The master bedroom felt different somehow, more personal. Ray found himself standing at the foot of the bed, looking at the nightstand, where a framed photograph sat face down. He picked it up carefully, brushing away the dust. The black and white image showed a young man in military uniform standing next to a woman in a simple dress. Ray recognized his grandfather's face, younger but with the same intense eyes he remembered from that childhood visit. The woman was beautiful, with a smile that seemed to light up the entire photograph. "Who's that?" Marcus had appeared beside him. "Your great-grandfather, I think, and maybe your great-grandmother." "I didn't know you had a great-grandmother," Emma said, joining them. "Neither did I." Ray set the photograph back on the nightstand and opened the top drawer. Inside, he found a small stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon, a military commendation medal, and a sealed envelope with Raymond written across it in careful script. His hands shook slightly as he opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. "Raymond, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you've inherited more than you know. I'm sorry we never got better acquainted. Your father was a good man, but he never understood why I chose this life out here. He thought I was running away from something. Truth is, I was running towards something. The land has secrets, boy. I spent 40 years learning them, and I still don't know everything, but I know enough. Look deeper than the surface. The real treasure isn't what most people would think to look for. Take care of Emma and Marcus. They've got your mother's heart and your stubborn streak. They'll need both. The compass in my desk drawer still works. So does everything else, if you know how to use it. Your grandfather, Samuel P.S. Dolores Martinez, lives about a mile east. She's good people. She'll help if you ask." Ray read the letter twice, then handed it to Emma. She read it aloud for Marcus, her voice growing more curious with each line. "What's he mean about secrets?" Marcus asked. "And who's Dolores Martinez?" Emma added. Ray folded the letter carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. "I guess we'll find out." They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the outbuildings. A barn that had seen better days, but still kept the weather out. A workshop filled with tools and equipment Ray couldn't immediately identify. A chicken coop that suggested Samuel had been more self-sufficient than anyone realized. As the sun began to set, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple that city kids rarely saw, they sat on the front porch sharing sandwiches. Ray had packed for the drive. The silence was different now, less hostile, more contemplative. "It's not Phoenix," Emma said finally. "No," Ray agreed. "It's not. But maybe that's not entirely a bad thing," she continued, surprising him. Marcus had found an old tennis ball and was throwing it against the barn wall, catching it on the bounce. "Dad, are we really going to stay here?" Ray looked at his children. "Really?" Looked at them. For the first time in months, Emma had grown taller since her mother's death, and there was something different in her posture. Less defeated. Marcus had dirt on his shoes and dust in his hair, but he was smiling as he played his simple game. "Yeah," Ray said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "I think we are." As darkness fell over the desert, they made beds with sheets they found in a linen closet and settled in for their first night at the ranch. Ray lay awake, listening to the sounds of a place that was foreign to him, but had somehow been waiting for his return. Somewhere out there, coyotes called to each other across the vast emptiness, and in the distance, he could swear he heard the echo of his grandfather's voice, promising that the real treasure wasn't what most people would think to look for. Ray woke to the sound of Emma's frustrated voice echoing through the thin walls. "This is ridiculous, Dad. There's no internet, no cell service, and now the shower doesn't work." He stumbled out of bed, still adjusting to the strange silence of the desert mornings. Back in Phoenix, they'd wake to traffic noise, neighbors starting their cars, the familiar hum of suburban life. Here, the only sounds were the wind through the eaves and the distant call of a roadrunner somewhere beyond the barn. In the bathroom, Ray found Emma standing in the shower stall, fully dressed, glaring at the rusted shower head that was producing nothing but air and the occasional drop of brown water. "The hot water heater probably needs to be lit," he said, running a hand through his grey-streaked hair, "and the pipes might be clogged. Give me a few hours to figure it out." A few hours. Emma's voice rose to a pitch that reminded him painfully of Sarah when she was frustrated. "Dad, I have to wash my hair. I can't go around looking like this." Marcus appeared in the doorway, his sandy hair sticking up at odd angles. "There's no milk for cereal," he announced. "And the toaster doesn't work." Ray closed his eyes and counted to 10. They'd been here exactly 12 hours, and already his children were staging a minor revolt. Part of him understood their frustration, but another part, the part that remembered his grandfather's letter about looking deeper than the surface, felt a stubborn determination to make this work. "Okay," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Emma, there's probably a well somewhere on the property. We'll figure out the water situation. Marcus, we'll drive into town today and get supplies. This isn't going to be easy, but nothing worthwhile ever is." Emma crossed her arms. "Worthwhile? Dad, this place is falling apart. We gave up everything for this dump in the middle of nowhere. Mom would have hated this." The words hit Ray like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, though they were, but because part of him wondered if Emma was right. Sarah had loved their little house in Phoenix, with its neat front yard and friendly neighbors. She'd loved the sounds of the city, the convenience of having everything within walking distance. Would she have understood this desperate gamble? But as Ray walked through the house, assessing what needed immediate attention, he found himself remembering other things about Sarah, how she'd grown up on her grandmother's farm in North Carolina, how she'd talked about wanting to show the kids what it meant to work with your hands, to be self-sufficient, how she'd worried that they were raising city kids who didn't know where their food came from or what it meant to fix something instead of throwing it away. In the kitchen, Ray opened the refrigerator they'd managed to get running the night before. Empty, except for a few bottles of water and some questionable condiments Samuel had left behind. The gas range worked, but they'd need to stock up on everything else. He was making a mental list of supplies when Marcus called out from the living room. "Dad, come look at this." Ray found his son sitting at Samuel's old roll-top desk, which they'd uncovered the previous evening. Marcus had opened the drawers and was examining their contents with the focused attention he usually reserved for video. "Games! Look what I found," Marcus said, holding up a brass compass. It was old but beautifully crafted, with intricate engravings around the edge and a needle that moved smoothly in its housing. "It's like something from a pirate movie." Ray took the compass carefully, feeling its weight in his palm. This had to be what Samuel mentioned in his letter. The compass still worked, he'd said, but worked for what? As Ray held the compass level, something strange happened. The needle didn't point north as expected. Instead, it swung toward the southeast, trembling slightly, before settling on a direction that seemed to pull at something deep in the earth. "That's weird," Emma said, joining them despite her earlier mood. "Is it broken?" "I don't think so," Ray said, studying the compass face. The engravings weren't decorative as he'd first thought. They were markings, degrees, directions, and symbols he didn't recognize. "Look at this." He moved the compass around the room, watching the needle's behavior. Near the windows, it pointed in one direction. By the fireplace, it shifted to another. But when he stood in the center of the room, it consistently pointed southeast, toward the back of the property. "It's not pointing to magnetic north," Ray realized. "It's pointing to something else." Marcus leaned in closer. "Like what?" "I have no idea." Ray turned the compass over, looking for markings or clues. On the back, engraved in small script, were the words, "Truth lies beneath, SD 1963. Emma read the inscription aloud. SD Samuel Delaney. But what truth? Ray walked to the front door, compass in hand. Outside, the needle behaved even more strangely, swinging wildly before settling on the same southeastern direction. Whatever it was pointing toward lay somewhere beyond the barn, in an area of the property they hadn't explored yet. The phone rang inside the house, an actual landline telephone that Ray hadn't noticed before, sitting on a small table near the kitchen. He answered it expecting a wrong number or maybe the attorney settling final details of the inheritance. Instead, he heard his brother Mike's familiar voice, heavy with condescension. "So, how's life in paradise, little brother?" Ray could hear noise in the background. Traffic, car horns, the sounds of Phoenix morning rush hour. Mike was probably calling from his office at the insurance company, where he'd worked his way up to regional manager. "Steady job, steady paycheck, steady life. We're settling in," Ray said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Right. Listen, I've been thinking about your situation out there. I talked to a guy who knows about desert real estate. He says that area's probably only good for cattle grazing, if that. Maybe you should consider cutting your losses. It's been one day, Mike." "Come on, Ray, be realistic. You've got 2 kids to think about. Emma needs to be in school, not playing Little House on the Prairie in the middle of nowhere. And what about Marcus? Kid's going to turn into a hermit." Ray looked out the window at his son, who was examining something he'd found near the old chicken coop, his face bright with curiosity. In Phoenix, Marcus had spent most of his time indoors, glued to screens. Here, after 12 hours, he was already exploring, asking questions, engaged with the physical world in a way Ray hadn't seen in years. "They're adapting," Ray said. "To what?" "Ray, there's nothing there. No jobs, no future, no opportunities. You're dragging those kids down with you because you're too proud to admit you made a mistake." Ray's grip tightened on the phone. "Thanks for the pep talk, Mike. I'm trying to help. Look, I'll make some calls. Maybe I can find you something here in Phoenix. Not great money, but enough to get you back on your feet. You can sell that ranch to whoever's stupid enough to want it. Take whatever you can get and start over properly." "And if I don't want to start over?" Mike's laugh was sharp. "Then you're even more stubborn than Dad was." At least he knew when to quit. After hanging up, Ray stood in the kitchen feeling the familiar weight of other people's expectations pressing down on him. His whole life, people had been telling him what he couldn't do, what he shouldn't try, what was impossible for someone. With his background and limitations, high school guidance counselors who steered him toward trade school instead of college, employers who saw him as a pair of hands, not a mind. Even Sarah, God rest her soul, who'd loved him, but sometimes looked at him with a mixture of affection and gentle disappointment, as if she'd married a man who could have been more but somehow chosen less. But Samuel's letter had suggested something different. The old man had believed Ray would understand the true value of the land, not its market price or development potential, but something deeper. Ray picked up the compass again, watching its needle point steadily toward the unknown. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt something that might have been hope-stirring. In his chest, Emma found him there an hour later, still studying the compass. "Dad, I'm sorry about what I said, about Mom hating this place." Ray looked at his daughter, seeing something in her expression he hadn't noticed before. Beneath the teenage resentment and grief, there was curiosity. Maybe even a little excitement. "Your mom would have understood," he said. "She always said the best adventures start with being a little bit scared and a lot determined." "So what are we going to do?" Ray held up the compass, its needle pointing steadily toward whatever secrets lay buried in the desert soil. "We're going to follow where this leads us, but first we need supplies and you need to wash your hair." Emma actually smiled at that. "Deal. But I want to see where the compass points first." They spent the next hour walking the property, following the compass's guidance. It led them past the barn, through a grove of mesquite trees, to an area where the desert floor looked different somehow. Not disturbed exactly, but not entirely natural either, as if the land had been shaped by human hands and then left to return to nature. Marcus ran ahead, his earlier complaints about missing Phoenix apparently forgotten. "There's something here," he called back to them. "Look at this." Where he stood, the ground formed a slight depression, circular and about 20 feet across. At the center, barely visible above the scrub grass, was what looked like the top of an old well. Ray approached carefully, compass still in hand. As they got closer to the well, the needle spun more frantically, as if whatever it was detecting lay directly beneath their feet. Emma knelt beside the old well cover, brushing away decades of accumulated dirt and debris. "Dad, there's writing." Here, carved into the stone cover, worn by time but still readable, were the words, "Delaney Mine, 1923. Ray felt something shift in his understanding of his family's history. This wasn't just a ranch Samuel had bought for solitude. This was land that had belonged to the Delaneys for generations, land with secrets that went deeper than anyone had imagined. As he knelt beside his children, studying the old well that might not be a well at all, Ray realized that Mike was wrong about one thing. There was definitely something here. Something worth finding, worth fighting for. The compass needle trembled in his palm, pointing straight down into the earth, toward whatever truth Samuel Delaney had spent 40 years protecting. The trip to Copper Ridge, the nearest town, took 40 minutes of dusty driving through landscape that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. Population 847, according to a sun-faded sign, though Ray suspected that number was optimistic. Main Street consisted of a grocery store, a hardware store, a diner called Martha's Place, and a gas station that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Carter administration. But the people were friendly enough. The clerk at Henderson's Hardware, no relation to Ray's former employer, just one of those coincidences that happen in small places, helped them load up on basic supplies, plumbing parts, electrical components, cleaning supplies, and enough. "Groceries to last a week. You folks the new owners of the Delaney place?" the clerk asked as he rang up their purchases. "That's right," Ray said. "Did you know Samuel?" The clerk, whose name tag read Pete, nodded slowly. Sam was good people, kept to himself mostly, but he'd come in here every couple weeks for supplies. Always paid cash, always knew exactly what he needed. Strange old bird, though. Strange how? Pete glanced around the store, then leaned closer. "Well, for a man who supposedly just raised a few head of cattle, he sure bought a lot of mining equipment over the years. Picks, shovels, metal detectors, even some kind of geological survey gear from a catalog company. Made folks wonder what he was really up to out there." Ray felt his pulse quicken. "Did he ever say anything about it?" "Not directly. But my dad used to run this store, and he always said Sam's grandfather had been a prospector back in the 20s. Found some promising mineral traces but never developed them. Maybe Sam was just carrying on the family tradition." On the drive back to the ranch, Emma and Marcus peppered Ray with questions about what Pete had said. The idea that their great-great-grandfather had been searching for minerals added a new dimension to the mystery of the compass and the old well. Back at the ranch, Ray decided to explore the basement more thoroughly. He'd noticed a door down there the previous day, but hadn't investigated. With a flashlight from their new supplies, he made his way down the creaky wooden stairs. The basement was larger than he'd expected, stretching under most of the house. One section had clearly been used for storage. Old furniture, boxes of books, tools and equipment covered with dusty tarps. But in the far corner, behind a stack of wooden crates, Ray found something that made him catch his breath. Built into the wall was what looked like a safe, but when he cleared away the cobwebs and debris, he realized it was something else entirely. A steel door painted to match the concrete wall, with a combination lock that looked military-grade. Above the lock, painted in small letters, were the words "Survey Records, Authorized Personnel Only." Ray tried the handle, not expecting it to open, but to his surprise, it turned easily. The door swung open with a well-oiled silence that suggested Samuel had maintained whatever was behind it, even if he'd let the rest of the house deteriorate. Inside the hidden compartment, Ray found shelves lined with carefully organized materials. Maps, photographs, documents in protective sleeves, and at the very back, a leather-bound journal with Mining Survey Delaney Property embossed on the cover. Ray opened the journal carefully, aware that he might be holding a piece of family history that went back generations. The first entry was dated July 15, 1923, written in careful script, began preliminary survey of mineral traces found in the southeastern section. Father believes we may have stumbled onto something significant. The magnetic readings are unlike anything we've seen in this part of Arizona. We'll continue mapping the underground formations. Ray flipped through more pages, seeing detailed drawings of geological formations, mineral samples taped to pages with careful notations, and maps that corresponded to areas of their property. The handwriting changed several times throughout the journal, suggesting multiple generations had contributed to the survey work. Near the middle of the journal, he found an entry that made his hands tremble. October 3rd, 1925. The vein extends, much deeper than originally estimated. Conservative calculations suggest reserves that could exceed anything found in this region. However, federal agents visited today asking questions about our activities. Father believes we're being watched, have decided to seal the main shaft, and continue investigations discreetly. The final entries were in handwriting Ray recognized from the letter Samuel had left him. March 12, 1963. 40 years of careful documentation confirms what my grandfather suspected. The mineral deposits are extensive and valuable beyond our wildest estimates, but the federal interest hasn't decreased. Men in suits come through town asking questions about the Delaney property every few years. I've decided to wait. The treasure will still be here when the time is right, and the right person comes along to handle it responsibly. December 1st, 1983. Raymond visited today with his family. Didn't get much chance to talk to the boy, but he has good hands and steady eyes. His father still thinks I'm a crazy old hermit, but Raymond looked at this place differently, like he could see the possibilities. If something happens to me, I hope he'll understand what I've spent my life protecting. Ray sat on an overturned crate, journal in his lap, trying to process what he'd discovered. His family hadn't just inherited a rundown ranch. They'd inherited a mystery that stretched back a century, with mineral deposits that might be worth more than he could imagine. Footsteps on the basement stairs interrupted his thoughts. Emma appeared, flashlight in hand. "Dad, you've been down here for 2 hours. We were starting to worry." Ray held up the journal. "Emma, I think your great-great-great-grandfather was a mining engineer." Emma picked her way through the basement clutter and sat beside him on another crate. Ray showed her the journal entries, watching her eyes widen as she read about magnetic readings and mineral veins and federal interest in their property. "This is incredible," she said, carefully turning pages. "Look at these drawings. Whoever did this knew what they were doing." Your great-grandfather Samuel continued the work. Spent 40 years mapping and documenting whatever's under our land. Emma studied a detailed geological cross-section that showed underground formations extending deep beneath the surface. "Dad, if this is accurate, there could be something really valuable down there. The question is, valuable enough to make all this worthwhile, to justify moving you kids out here, to risk everything on the possibility that a bunch of old journals and strange compass readings might lead to something real?" Emma looked at him with an expression that reminded him painfully of Sarah, serious, thoughtful, but with an underlying strength that could surprise him. "Dad, remember what Mom used to say about taking chances?" Ray smiled, remembering. "That, the biggest risk is not taking any risk at all. And what else? That nothing important was ever discovered by people who were afraid to look foolish." Emma closed the journal carefully and handed it back to him. "Then I think we should find out what's down that old well." They spent the rest of the afternoon organizing the materials from Samuel's hidden archive, maps of the property with areas marked for high magnetic activity, photographs of rock samples with mineral traces that even Ray's untrained eye could see looked promising. Letters from geological survey companies dating back to the 1960s, all expressing interest in conducting more extensive surveys of the Delaney property. Marcus joined them when he got bored with exploring the outbuildings, and soon all three of them were spread across the living room floor, surrounded by decades of careful documentation. "It's like a treasure map," Marcus said, studying a survey chart that showed underground formations. "Except instead of X marks, the spot, it's all these scientific measurements and mineral traces. Real treasure hunting is a lot more complicated than the movies make it look," Ray said. "It takes patience, careful planning, and a lot of hard work." "But this is real, right?" Marcus asked. "I mean, all these papers and maps and stuff. Someone didn't make it up." Ray looked at the compass, which he'd placed on the coffee table. Even inside the house, its needle pointed steadily toward the area where they'd found the old well. "I think it's real. The question is whether we're the right people to do something about it." Emma had been studying one of the more recent letters, dated 1978. "Dad, listen to this. It's from something called Western Geological Associates. Dear Mr. Delaney, our preliminary analysis of the mineral samples you provided shows promise for rare earth elements in concentrations that would be commercially viable with proper extraction methods. We would be interested in discussing a joint venture to develop these resources." There's a whole box of letters like this. "Samuel never responded to any of them," Ray said, having read several similar letters earlier. "He was protecting something, waiting for the right time or the right person. Or maybe he was waiting for us," Marcus said, with the kind of simple wisdom that sometimes comes from 12-year-olds. As evening fell, they sat on the front porch sharing another meal of sandwiches and canned soup, but the conversation was different from the night before. Instead of focusing on what was broken or missing, they talked about possibilities. What they might find, what it could mean, how they might go about exploring further without attracting unwanted attention. Ray found himself looking at his children with new appreciation. Emma's analytical mind, inherited from her mother, was perfect for understanding the technical aspects of the surveys and geological reports. Marcus's enthusiasm and curiosity would be essential for the physical work of exploration. And Ray himself brought 42 years of mechanical experience, of solving problems with his hands and figuring out how things worked. For the first time since Sarah's death, Ray felt like they might actually be a team again. Not just three people sharing the same house and the same grief, but a family with a common purpose. "So what's our next step?" Emma asked, as they watched the sun set over the desert. Ray picked up the compass, watching its needle point steadily toward their future. "Tomorrow we start mapping the property systematically. We figure out exactly what Samuel was looking for and where he thought it might be. And then we decide whether we're brave enough to dig for it." "Are we?" Marcus asked. Ray looked at his son, then at Emma, then out at the vast desert that surrounded their new home. "I think we might be." Ray woke before dawn, pulled from sleep, by sounds he couldn't immediately identify. Not the traffic and sirens he'd grown accustomed to in Phoenix, but something else. Footsteps on gravel, the soft whicker of a horse, a woman's voice speaking Spanish in low, soothing tones. He pulled on his jeans and stepped onto the front porch, just as the sun was painting the eastern mountains in shades of rose and gold. A woman was standing near their car, holding the reins of a bay mare that was drinking from a metal bucket she'd apparently brought with her. She looked to be in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent under the desert sun. When she saw Ray, she smiled and raised a hand in greeting. "You must be Raymond," she said, her voice carrying just a trace of accent. "I'm Dolores Martinez. Your grandfather mentioned me in his letter, I think." Ray approached carefully, not wanting to spook the horse. "Samuel wrote about you. Said you were good people." Dolores's smile deepened. "He was kind. I live about a mile east, like he told you. When I saw smoke from your chimney yesterday, I figured I should come introduce myself. Brought some fresh eggs and milk." She gestured to saddlebags draped across the horse's back. "That's very thoughtful." Samuel would have wanted me to look out for you. We were—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Good friends for many years. He talked about you and your children often, especially after your wife passed. I'm sorry for your loss." Ray felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever someone mentioned Sarah. "Thank you." Emma and Marcus emerged from the house, drawn by the sound of voices. Both stopped short when they saw the horse. "Can I pet him?" Marcus asked. "Immediately her," Dolores corrected with a smile. "And yes, but let her sniff your hand first. Her name is Luna." While Marcus made friends with the mare, Dolores unpacked her saddlebags, producing a dozen brown eggs, a glass jar of milk, and what looked like homemade bread wrapped in a clean dish towel. "You don't have to feed us," Ray said, though his stomach growled at the thought of real food. "Nonsense. Besides, I have an ulterior motive." Dolores's eyes twinkled. "I've been curious about Samuel's workshop for 40 years, and he never let anyone inside. Now that you're here, I was hoping you might satisfy an old woman's curiosity." Ray found himself liking this woman immediately. There was something about her directness, her easy smile, that reminded him of Sarah's grandmother, someone who had earned the right to speak her mind through decades of hard work and honest living. "I haven't really explored the workshop myself yet," Ray admitted. "Then we can discover it together." They walked to the large outbuilding behind the barn, Dolores leading Luna while the children flanked them, chattering about their discoveries from the previous day. Ray had noticed the workshop during their initial exploration, but hadn't investigated thoroughly. The door was secured with a heavy padlock, but the key was among those the attorney had given him. Inside, they found what could only be described as a professional operation. Workbenches lined 2 walls, equipped with tools Ray recognized, and others that were completely foreign to him. Geological survey equipment, mineral testing apparatus, even what looked like a small smelting furnace in one corner. But it was the wall opposite the door that made everyone stop and stare. Covering the entire wall was a detailed map of the property, hand-drawn and marked with symbols, measurements and notations in several different handwritings. Different colored pins marked locations across the ranch, with lines connecting them in patterns that suggested careful surveying work. "My God," Dolores breathed. "Samuel, what were you up to all these years?" Ray approached the map slowly, recognizing some landmarks, the house, the barn, the grove of mesquite trees, but most of the marked locations were in areas they hadn't explored yet. And at the center of the map, marked with a large red X, was the area where they'd found the old well the day before. Emma was studying a workbench covered with what looked like mineral samples, rocks of various colors and compositions, each tagged with a date and location. "Dad, look at these. Some of them have numbers that look like chemical formulas." Marcus had found something even more interesting, a military footlocker pushed against the far wall. When Ray opened it, he found himself looking at Samuel's other life, the one his family had never known about. The footlocker contained military records, commendations, and photographs of Samuel in uniform. But not just any uniform. The insignia and documentation identified him as having served in Army intelligence during the Korean War. After the war, according to the papers, he'd worked as a civilian contractor on classified geological surveys for the military. "He wasn't just a rancher," Ray said, showing the documents to Dolores. "He was some kind of military geologist." Dolores picked up one of the photographs, showing a younger Samuel standing next to surveying equipment in what looked like a desert. Landscape similar to their own property. That explains so much. The equipment, the secrecy, why he never talked about his work. But it was what Ray found at the bottom of the footlocker that made everything click into place. Dog tags, worn and scratched but still readable. Samuel J. Delaney, Army Intelligence, security clearance, top secret. Emma looked up from the mineral samples. "Dad, what if Grandpa Samuel wasn't just continuing the family mining tradition? What if he knew something about this land from his military work?" Ray studied the map on the wall, noting the precision of the surveys, the professional quality of the documentation. This wasn't the work of an amateur prospector or a lonely old man with time on his hands. This was the systematic investigation of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. "Dolores," Ray said carefully, "in all the years you knew Samuel, did he ever hint at what he was really doing out here?" The older woman was quiet for a long moment, stroking Luna's neck as she considered the question. "Samuel was a careful man. He said things sometimes when we were riding the property together, but never directly. He'd point to different areas and talk about future possibilities or things that weren't ready yet." She paused, then added, "But about 6 months ago he started talking differently, like he was preparing for something." "How so?" he asked. "Me questions about you. What kind of man you were, how you handled responsibility, whether you could be trusted with important decisions. I told him you were your grandfather's grandson, even if you'd never had the chance to know each other properly." Ray felt a weight settling on his shoulders, not unpleasant, but significant. Samuel hadn't just left him a property. He'd left him a responsibility, a mission that had been decades in the making. Marcus, who had been unusually quiet, was standing near the smelting furnace, studying something on the workbench beside it. "Dad, I think you should see this." On the workbench was a small crucible containing what looked like refined metal. Not much, maybe an ounce or two, but it had an unusual sheen that caught the light in strange ways. Next to it was a notebook, open to a page filled with calculations and chemical formulas. Ray couldn't understand most of the technical notation, but he could read Samuel's handwritten notes in the margins. "Sample from southeastern quadrant, 15-foot depth. Purity exceeds 94%. Conservative estimate, 3.2 million ounces, recoverable with current methods." 3 million ounces of what?" Emma asked, reading over his shoulder. Ray looked at the refined metal in the crucible, then at the complex chemical. Formulas in the notebook. He wasn't a geologist, but he'd worked around metals his whole life, and this didn't look like anything he'd seen before. "I think we need to talk to an expert," he said finally. Dolores had been examining the mineral samples on the other workbench. "Samuel had books," she said suddenly. "Geology books, mining engineering texts. He ordered them from the university. Library sometimes. If you want to understand what he found, his research is probably the place to start." They spent the next hour exploring the workshop more systematically. In addition to the surveying equipment and mineral samples, they found detailed logs of Samuel's investigations going back more than 30 years. Weather records, equipment maintenance logs, and most importantly, maps showing the progression of his exploration. What emerged was the picture of a man who had approached his investigation with military precision and scientific rigor. Every sample was catalogued, every survey measurement recorded, every hypothesis tested and documented. He wasn't just looking for minerals, Emma realized, studying the progression of Samuel's work. He was mapping an entire underground formation. Look at these depth measurements. Some of these surveys go down more than 50 feet. Ray found himself thinking about Mike's phone call, about all the people who would tell him this was impossible, impractical, a fool's dream. But looking at Samuel's documentation, at 40 years of careful work, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months, genuine excitement. "Dolores," he said, "would you be willing to show us around the property? Point out the areas where Samuel spent the most time? I'd be honored to. Luna could use the exercise, and I know this land almost as well as Samuel did." She paused, then added with a meaningful look, "And I think it's time someone finished what he started." As they prepared to leave the workshop, Ray took one last look at the map on the wall. All those years of careful work, all that patience and planning leading to this moment. He thought about Samuel's letter, about looking deeper than the surface, about the compass that pointed toward something hidden. Beneath their feet, for the first time since inheriting the ranch, Ray began to understand what Samuel had really left them. Not just land, not just the possibility of wealth, but a legacy of perseverance and faith in the future. The old man had spent 40 years preparing for someone who would have the courage and determination to see his work through to completion. Ray picked up Samuel's dog tags, feeling their weight in his palm. Then he put them around his neck, under his shirt, where they would remind him that some missions are worth waiting a lifetime to complete. The hand-drawn geological map was spread across Samuel's kitchen table like a battle plan, its edges weighted down with coffee mugs and the compass that had started everything. Ray traced his finger along the carefully drawn contour lines, following underground formations that Samuel had spent decades mapping with surveyor's precision. "Your grandfather was methodical," Dolores said, pointing to areas marked with different colored inks. Blue marks for initial surveys, red for confirmed mineral traces, and green for what he called high-probability zones. She tapped a section of the map that corresponded to the area near the old well. "This whole southeastern quadrant is marked in green." Emma leaned over the map, her finger following a series of measurements that formed a rough circle around the well site. "These depth readings, some go down almost 60 feet. That's not casual digging." "Samuel had equipment," Dolores explained, "core sampling tools, things he'd acquired through his military contacts. He'd disappear for days at a time, working alone, always after dark or early morning when no one would see him." Ray felt the familiar weight of Samuel's dog tags against his chest. The more he learned about his grandfather, the more he realized how carefully the old man had planned for this moment. He knew someone would eventually continue his work. He hoped, Dolores corrected, but he wasn't certain until your wife passed and you lost your job. That's when he started talking about divine timing and things happening for a reason. Marcus had been unusually quiet, studying photographs of mineral samples that Samuel had carefully labeled and dated. "Dad, look at this one," he held up. A photo showing a rock that seemed to shimmer with an internal light, almost metallic, but with colors that shifted depending on the angle. Ray took the photograph, comparing it to Samuel's detailed notes. The sample was dated 3 months before Samuel's death, with notations that made Ray's pulse quicken. Depth, 47 feet. Purity, exceptional. Composition matches rare earth elements, used in advanced electronics and renewable energy applications. "Rare earth elements," Emma said, reading over his shoulder. "Dad, those are incredibly valuable. China controls most of the world's supply, and there's huge demand for wind turbines, solar panels, electric car batteries." Ray set down the photograph, understanding dawning. This wasn't just about finding gold or silver. Samuel had been sitting on deposits of materials that were essential to modern technology. Materials worth potentially hundreds of times more per ounce than precious metals. "That explains the federal interest," Dolores said quietly. "Men in suits asking questions, government surveyors driving through the area every few years. Samuel always said they were watching, waiting for someone to develop the deposit so they could find a reason to claim them for national security." Ray studied the map more carefully, noting the strategic positioning of Samuel's surveys. The old man hadn't just been looking for minerals randomly. He'd been systematically mapping an underground formation that extended across most of their property. "We need to be careful how we proceed," Ray said. "If Samuel was right about government interest, we can't just start digging without understanding the legal implications." Emma had found a folder of correspondence tucked behind the map. "Dad, listen to this. It's a letter from 1985, from something called the Department of Interior Geological Survey." She read aloud. "Mr. Delaney, we are aware of your activities on the property in question. While we appreciate your cooperation in providing periodic updates on your findings, we must remind you that any commercial development of strategic mineral resources requires federal oversight and approval." Samuel was reporting to them, Ray realized, keeping them informed, but not giving them enough information to justify seizure. "Smart man," Dolores said with evident pride. "He was protecting the land until the right person came along to handle it properly." They spent the morning walking the property with Dolores as their guide, following trails that Samuel had created during 4 decades of systematic exploration. Luna picked her way carefully over rocky terrain, while Dolores pointed out subtle Landmarks, a distinctive rock formation here, a change in vegetation there, that corresponded to high-activity areas on Samuel's map. At the old well site, Ray used a flashlight to peer down the shaft. What he'd initially taken for a water well was clearly something else entirely. The walls were reinforced with concrete and steel, and the shaft extended far deeper than any well would need to go. Samuel called it his access point, Dolores explained. He'd lower equipment down there, take core samples from different depths. Sometimes I'd hear machinery running at night, but he made me promise never to investigate. Marcus dropped a stone down the shaft, counting seconds until they heard it hit bottom. That's got to be at least 50 feet deep. Emma was examining the concrete collar around the well opening, running her hands over inscriptions that had been worn smooth by decades of desert weather. There's something carved here. Looks like coordinates, maybe? Ray knelt beside her, brushing sand from the carved numbers. They were definitely coordinates, but also what looked like depth measurements and dates going back to 1963. Samuel documented everything here, Ray said. Every survey, every sample, every measurement. This isn't just a well. It's a permanent record of 40 years of exploration. They were interrupted by the sound of an approaching vehicle. A dust cloud on the horizon resolved into a pickup truck moving fast down their access road. Ray felt a moment of tension, wondering if their activities had attracted unwanted attention. But as the truck got closer, he recognized the driver. Mike climbed out of his truck with the kind of aggressive energy that meant he'd driven 3 hours from Phoenix specifically to have an argument. "Ray, what the hell are you doing out here?" "Nice to see you too, Mike." "Don't give me that. I drove by yesterday and saw you digging around, and now there's an old woman with a horse acting like she owns the place." Mike gestured dismissively at Dolores, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Emma stepped forward, her teenage protective instincts kicking in. "This is Dolores Martinez. She was Grandpa Samuel's friend, and she's helping us understand the property." "Friend?" Mike's laugh was harsh. "Ray, you've been here 3 days, and you're already trusting random neighbors with whatever half-baked treasure hunting scheme you've cooked up." Ray felt heat rising in his chest. "It's not a scheme, Mike." Samuel left detailed documentation. "Of what?" "Ray, I talked to 3 different real estate agents on the drive out here. You know what this land is worth? Maybe 50,000 on a good day, if you could find someone stupid enough to want it. And that's assuming you could even get clear title, which is questionable given how long the old man let everything go." Marcus had been standing quietly near the well, but now he spoke up with the kind of simple honesty that children sometimes possess. "Uncle Mike, why are you so angry about us trying to make something work?" Mike's expression softened slightly when he looked at his nephew, but his voice remained sharp. "Because I don't want to see your dad drag you kids down with him. You belong in school, in a real town with real opportunities, not out here playing cowboys and Indians in the middle of nowhere." "We're not playing," Emma said, her voice level but firm. "We're learning things. About our family, about the land, about what it means to work towards something instead of just giving up when things get difficult." The criticism hit Mike like a physical blow. Ray could see his brother struggling with something, guilt maybe, or recognition of truths he didn't want to acknowledge. Dolores, who had been quietly observing the family dynamics, stepped forward, with the kind of calm authority that comes from 7 decades of dealing with difficult people. "Mr. Delaney," she said to Mike, "your brother is doing something important here. Samuel spent 40 years preparing for someone with the vision and determination to see his work through. Maybe instead of trying to talk him out of it, you should ask yourself why you're so afraid of him succeeding." Mike's face flushed red. "Lady, I don't know you from Adam, but—" "You know what?" Ray interrupted, his voice carrying a firmness that surprised everyone, including himself. "That's enough. Mike, I appreciate your concern, but we're staying. We're going to explore what Samuel left us, and we're going to do it as a family." "Ray, I said that's enough." Ray looked at his brother, really looked at him. For the first time in years, Mike was successful by conventional standards, comfortable in his insurance office, secure in his steady paycheck. But there was something in his eyes that Ray recognized from his own mirror during those desperate months after. Sarah's death, fear. "You're scared," Ray said, the realization coming as he spoke. "Not for us, of us. You're scared that we might actually find something out here, make something of ourselves, prove that there are other ways to live besides the safe, predictable path you chose." Mike opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. For a moment, the desert silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind through the mesquite trees and Luna's gentle snorting. Finally, Mike shook his head. "You're making a mistake, Ray. When this falls apart, and it will, don't expect me to pick up the pieces." He walked back to his truck, then paused with his hand on the door handle. "Emma, Marcus, you call me if you need anything. Anything at all. You don't have to go down with this ship." After Mike's truck disappeared in a cloud of dust, the four of them stood in the desert silence, processing what had just happened. "I'm sorry about that," Ray said to Dolores. She waved dismissively. "Family is complicated, but I think you handled him exactly right. Sometimes people need to know where you stand." Emma moved closer to Ray, and for a moment he saw Sarah in her face, not just the physical resemblance, but something deeper. The quiet strength that Sarah had shown during her illness, the determination to face difficult things with dignity. "Dad," Emma said, "I think we should start digging." Ray looked at his daughter, then at Marcus, then at the map they'd been studying. 3 days ago, they'd been a broken family running from failure. Now they were standing on land that might hold the key to a future none of them had imagined. He picked up the compass, watching its needle point steadily toward the underground formations Samuel had spent 40 years mapping. "Then I guess we better figure out how to do it right." The sealed envelope was tucked behind Samuel's geological maps, yellowed with age, and marked Confidential Geological Survey Company, 1965, in official-looking stamps and seals. Ray found it while organizing Samuel's research materials, and something about its placement suggested it had been deliberately hidden from casual discovery. Inside was a professionally prepared geological assessment, complete with technical diagrams, mineral composition analyses, and economic projections that made Ray's hands shake as he read them. "Dad," Emma looked up from her own stack of documents. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Ray held up the survey. "Report. Maybe I have. This is from Western Geological Associates, dated 40 years ago. They did core sampling across our entire property." Emma set down her papers and moved to read over his shoulder. Marcus, who had been sketching pictures of the minerals they'd found, joined them at the kitchen table. "Listen to this," Ray said. "Finding the summary page. Preliminary analysis confirms extensive rare earth mineral deposits throughout the surveyed area. Conservative estimates suggest recoverable reserves in excess of 3 million ounces, with current market values exceeding $300 million. Recommendation: immediate development with appropriate environmental safeguards." The silence that followed was broken only by the wind rattling the kitchen windows and the distant call of a hawk somewhere over the desert. $300 million. "Dollars," Marcus said finally, his voice small in the vast quiet of the house. Emma took the report from Ray's hands, studying the technical specifications and economic projections. "Dad, this is dated 1965. If these deposits were worth 300 million 40 years ago, what would they be worth now?" Ray felt Samuel's dog tags against his chest, understanding more clearly why the old man had been so secretive, so careful. This wasn't just a family inheritance. It was a responsibility that could change not just their lives, but potentially the economic future of the entire region. "There's more," he said, pulling out additional documents from the envelope. Letters, contracts, legal opinions, and what appeared to be correspondence with federal agencies. Samuel didn't just know about the deposits. He was actively managing interest from multiple parties while protecting the land from premature development. Dolores arrived as they were spreading the documents across the table, Luna's hoofbeats announcing their approach long before she knocked. On the door, when she saw the geological survey report, her expression grew serious. "He showed that to you then," she said, settling into a chair without being asked. "Samuel said he'd hidden it where only the right person would think to look. You knew about this?" "Pieces of it. Samuel was careful about what he shared, even with me. But I knew the land was valuable, and I knew he was protecting it from people who would exploit it without considering the consequences." Ray studied the report's environmental impact section, noting concerns about groundwater, wildlife habitats, and the effects of large-scale mining on desert ecosystems. He wasn't just protecting the minerals, he was protecting the land itself. Emma had found a folder containing correspondence between Samuel and environmental groups, legal firms, and what appeared to be Native American tribal councils. "Dad, look at this." He was building a coalition of people who wanted to ensure any development would be done responsibly. Samuel believed in what he called generational thinking, Dolores explained, making decisions based on what would be best for children and grandchildren, not just immediate profit. He said most people think in quarters and fiscal years, but the land thinks in centuries. Marcus was studying a detailed map that showed not just mineral deposits, but also wildlife migration patterns, water sources, and areas of particular ecological significance. He marked all the places where animals come to drink water. "And look," he pointed to a section of the map, "this whole area is marked Preserve for Future Generations." Ray felt the weight of understanding settling on his shoulders. Samuel hadn't just left them a treasure, he'd left them a test. The question wasn't whether they could find the minerals or extract them profitably. The question was whether they had the wisdom to do it in a way that honored both the land and the future. "There's something else," Dolores said quietly. "Something. Samuel made me promise to tell you when you were ready to hear it." She pulled a small leather journal from her jacket pocket, its pages filled with Samuel's careful handwriting. This is his personal journal from the last year of his life. His thoughts about what he was leaving behind and what he hoped would happen next. Ray opened the journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon, Samuel's. Handwriting was less steady than in his earlier documents, but his thoughts were clear. Raymond will inherit more than land and minerals. He'll inherit a choice that will define what kind of man he is and what kind of legacy he leaves his children. The easy path is to sell to the highest bidder and walk away rich. The hard path is to develop the resources responsibly, creating something that benefits everyone, the family, the community, the land itself. I've spent 40 years preparing for this moment. Not just mapping the deposits, but building relationships with people who can help ensure the right choices get made. Environmental scientists, tribal elders, community leaders, legal experts who understand how to navigate the federal bureaucracy. They're all waiting to see what Raymond decides. The minerals are worth more money than any of us could spend in a lifetime. But the real treasure is the opportunity to show that development and conservation can work together, that profit and responsibility aren't mutually exclusive. If Raymond chooses the hard path, he'll face opposition from people who want quick profits and easy answers. He'll need courage, patience, and the wisdom to listen to people who understand the long-term consequences of the choices he makes. But if he succeeds, he'll leave his children something more valuable than money. He'll leave them an example of what it means to be worthy of the gifts we've been given. Ray closed the journal, feeling the full weight of Samuel's expectations. The old man hadn't just been mapping mineral deposits. He'd been creating a test of character that would determine whether his descendants deserved the legacy he was leaving them. Emma had been reading over his shoulder, and now she looked at him with an expression that reminded him powerfully of Sarah. "Dad, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking your great-grandfather was a lot more complicated than anyone realized, and I'm thinking we need to be very careful about our next steps." Marcus had found another document in the envelope, a list of names and contact information. with a note attached. People you can trust to help you make the right decisions. The list included environmental lawyers, mining engineers who specialized in sustainable extraction, representatives from local Native American tribes, and community leaders from towns throughout the region. At the top of the list, circled in red ink, was a name that made Ray catch his breath. Dr. Sarah Martinez Chen, Environmental Engineering, University of Arizona. Dolores' niece. She'll understand what you're trying to accomplish. Dolores smiled when she saw Ray's expression. Sarah is my brother's daughter. She's been waiting 30 years for someone to call her about the Delaney property. She has ideas about how to develop the resources in a way that creates jobs and protects the environment. Samuel planned all of this, Ray realized. Every piece, every connection, every safeguard. He wasn't just leaving us an inheritance, he was leaving us a roadmap for how to handle it responsibly. Emma stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the desert landscape that stretched endlessly toward the mountains. Dad, there's something I need to tell you. I've been researching rare earth minerals online, trying to understand what we might have found. She turned back to face them, her expression serious. The deposits Samuel mapped, if they're as extensive as these reports suggest, they could supply the entire U.S. renewable energy industry for decades. Solar panels, wind turbines, electric car batteries, grid-scale energy storage systems. We're not just talking about money, we're talking about the future of clean energy in America. Ray felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening air. Emma, what are you saying? I'm saying that if we handle this right, we could do more than make our family wealthy. We could help solve one of the biggest problems facing the planet. But if we handle it wrong, if we let greed or impatience drive our decisions, we could destroy something irreplaceable. Dolores reached across the table and took Ray's hand, her weathered fingers warm and steady. Samuel knew you would understand. When the time came, he saw something in you that even you didn't know was there. Ray looked around the table at his family and the woman who had become their guide to Samuel's legacy. 3 days ago, he'd been an unemployed mechanic with 2 grieving children and a load of debt. Now he was sitting on what might be one of the most significant mineral discoveries in decades, with the power to change not just his family's future, but potentially the direction of American energy policy. So what do we do? He asked. Emma smiled. And for a moment Ray saw not just Sarah in her face, but something of Samuel's quiet determination as well. We do what Grandpa Samuel did. We take our time, we ask the right questions, and we make sure we're worthy of what we've been given. Ray picked up the compass that had started everything, watching its needlepoint steadily toward the future. Buried beneath their feet. For the first time since Sarah's death, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Then I guess we better call Dr. Martinez Chen, he said. The steel document box was hidden behind a false back panel in Samuel's bedroom closet, secured with a combination lock that had been painted to match the wall. Ray found it while searching for winter clothes they'd need as the desert nights grew colder, guided by a cryptic note in Samuel's journal. When you're ready for the truth, look where a man keeps his most private thoughts. The combination. Emma's. Birthday in reverse. Opened easily, as if Samuel had planned for this exact moment. Inside the fireproof box, Ray found documents that would change everything he thought he knew about their inheritance. Not just geological surveys and mineral assessments, but legal papers that went back centuries, wrapped in oiled cloth and preserved with the kind of care reserved for the most precious family heirlooms. The first document took Ray's breath away. Hand-lettered on parchment in faded Spanish, with official seals and ribbons that had somehow survived 300 years of Arizona weather and family neglect. Even without understanding the language, Ray recognized the formal structure of a legal document, the kind of elaborate script and ceremonial presentation that spoke of royal authority. "Emma," he called, his voice strange in the quiet house. "You need to see this." Emma found him sitting on Samuel's bed, surrounded by documents spread across the faded quilt. "Dad, what is it?" "I think it's a Spanish land grant. From 1723. Ray held up the parchment carefully, afraid it might crumble at his touch. "Look at these signatures, these official seals. This isn't some family document. This is a legal title issued by the Spanish crown." Emma sat beside him on the bed, studying the elaborate calligraphy and heraldic symbols. "Can you read any of it?" "No, but look at this." Ray pointed to a section of the document where the formal Spanish gave way to careful English translation, written in different ink and clearly added later. "Someone translated the important parts." Emma read aloud, "By royal grant of His Catholic Majesty Philip V, King of Spain, the lands described herein are granted in perpetuity to Alejandro Delaney and his heirs, including all surface rights, mineral rights and water rights, to be held in trust for future generations of the Delaney family." Ray felt the world shift around him. Alejandro Delaney. That has to be our ancestor. "Dad, if this is legitimate, if our family has held mineral rights to this land for 300 years, then no government agency, no federal oversight, no eminent domain claim can touch us. We own not just the surface, but everything beneath it." Ray picked up another document from the box, a thick folder of legal papers dating from the 1800s through the 1960s. The story they told was one of careful legal protection spanning generations. When Mexico gained independence from Spain, the Delaney family had successfully petitioned the Mexican government to honor the original Spanish grant. When the United States acquired Arizona through the Mexican-American War, they'd navigated the complex process of having their Mexican title recognized under American law. Samuel wasn't just a careful man, Ray realized, studying decades of legal correspondence. He was continuing a family tradition that went back centuries. Every generation of Delaneys fought to protect these mineral rights. Emma had found a folder marked Legal Precedents and Case Law, filled with Supreme Court decisions and federal rulings that established the principle that pre-existing Spanish and Mexican land grants superseded later federal claims to mineral rights. "Dad, listen to this. It's from a 1962 Supreme Court case." She read carefully. "When clear title to mineral rights can be established through documented Spanish colonial grants, federal authority to claim strategic resources for national security purposes is limited by constitutional protections of private property rights." "Samuel knew," Ray said, understanding flooding through him. "All those years of careful documentation, all that correspondence with federal agencies. He wasn't just protecting the deposits from development. He was building a legal case that would establish our family's absolute ownership when the time came to develop them." Marcus appeared in the doorway, drawn by the excitement in their voices. "What did you find?" Ray held up the Spanish land grant, its ancient parchment crackling softly in the desert air. "Your inheritance, son. Your real inheritance." They spent the next several hours going through every document in the box, piecing together a legal story that spanned 3 centuries. Birth certificates and marriage records proving an unbroken line of descent from Alejandro Delaney to Samuel to Ray. Property transfer documents showing that the mineral rights had never been sold, mortgaged, or transferred to any outside party. Most importantly, a thick folder of correspondence between Samuel and some of the most prestigious law firms in the Southwest, all confirming that the Delaney family's claim to the mineral deposits was legally unassailable. But it was the final document in the box that made Ray understand the full scope of what Samuel had accomplished. A legal opinion, dated just 6 months before Samuel's death, signed by a federal judge who had reviewed all the historical documentation. In the matter of mineral rights to the property described as the Delaney Ranch, I find that the Spanish land grant of 1723 properly transferred through Mexican authority and recognized under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, establishes clear and absolute title to all mineral resources. No federal, state, or local authority has the legal standing to claim these resources for public use without fair compensation equal to full market value, which current geological surveys suggest would exceed $500 million. Ray read the passage twice, then set the document down with shaking hands. $500 million. Emma was studying the judge's legal opinion, her expression growing more amazed with each paragraph. "Dad, it gets better. Look at this footnote." She read, "The Delaney mineral deposits represent one of the largest known reserves of rare earth elements within United States borders. Development of these resources under private ownership could reduce American dependence on foreign suppliers by an estimated 40%. We're not just wealthy," Ray realized. "We're strategically important to national security." Marcus had been unusually quiet, studying the Spanish land grant with the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for video games. "Dad, there's something else here. Look at this symbol." At the bottom of the parchment, beneath the official seals and signatures, was a small drawing that Ray had initially dismissed as decorative flourish. Looking more closely, he realized it was a compass rose, 8 points radiating from a central circle with symbols at each point that looked remarkably similar to the engravings on Samuel's brass compass. "It's the same compass," Emma breathed. "The one we found in Samuel's desk. It wasn't just a surveying tool, it was a family heirloom that goes back to the original land grant." Ray pulled Samuel's compass from his pocket, comparing the engravings to the drawing on the parchment. The match was unmistakable. Somehow, across 3 centuries, the Delaney family had preserved not just their legal claim to the land, but the actual physical compass that their ancestor had used to survey and map the original grant. "That's why it doesn't point to magnetic north," Ray said, understanding finally clicking into place. "It points to the center of the mineral deposits. Alejandro Delaney built it specifically to help his descendants find what he'd hidden." Emma took the compass from Ray's hands, watching its needle swing toward the southeast quadrant of their property. "Dad, do you realize what this means? We don't just own the minerals, we have a 300-year-old treasure map showing us exactly where to find them." The sound of vehicles approaching interrupted their celebration. Ray looked out the bedroom window to see 2 black SUVs making their way up the ranch road, dust billowing behind them like storm clouds. "Government plates," Ray said grimly. "Looks like someone's been monitoring our activities." Emma quickly began gathering the documents, her movements precise and purposeful. "Dad, we need to get these somewhere safe. If they're here to make some kind of federal claim, they can't," Ray interrupted, his voice carrying a confidence that surprised him. "That's the whole point. These documents prove that our mineral rights predate the federal government's authority to claim them." Marcus ran to the front window. "There are 4 men getting out. They look like FBI or something." Ray felt Samuel's dog tags against his chest, drawing strength from the knowledge that the old man had spent 40 years preparing for this exact moment. "Emma, put the original documents back in the box and hide it. Keep copies of everything. We need to prove our case." "What are you going to do?" Ray picked up the Spanish land grant, handling it with careful reverence for its age and significance. "I'm going to introduce our visitors to 300 years of Delaney family legal precedent." The lead agent, tall, serious, with the kind of military bearing that spoke of either federal law enforcement or intelligence work, introduced himself as Agent Harrison from the Department of Interior. His credentials looked official enough, but Ray noticed the way his eyes immediately went to the geological maps and mineral samples they'd left spread across the kitchen table. "Mr. Delaney, we understand you've been conducting unauthorized surveys on this property." "Unauthorized by whom?" Ray asked calmly. "The federal government maintains oversight authority over strategic mineral resources, particularly those that might affect national security." Ray set the Spanish land grant on the kitchen table, its ancient parchment and official seals immediately drawing the agent's attention. "Agent Harrison, I'd like you to meet my family's mineral rights, established by royal grant of the Spanish. Crown in 1723 and continuously maintained under Mexican and American law for 300 years. The agent leaned forward to examine the document, his professional composure slipping slightly as he recognized the legal implications of what he was seeing. "Sir, I'll need to have our legal department review these claims." "Of course," Ray said. "Pleasantly, you'll find that the Supreme Court has already ruled on the validity of Spanish colonial land grants in United States versus Sandoval, 1962. Pre-existing mineral rights supersede federal authority to claim strategic resources." Agent Harrison looked uncomfortable, clearly not prepared to encounter a property owner who understood the legal complexities of mineral rights and federal oversight. "Mr. Delaney, regardless of historical claims, any large-scale mining operation will require environmental impact assessments, federal permits, which we'll be happy to obtain when we're ready to begin development," Emma interrupted, her voice carrying the same calm confidence as her father's. "But as the legal owners of these mineral deposits, we'll be conducting that development according to our own timeline and environmental standards." Ray felt a surge of pride watching his daughter stand up to federal agents with the poise of someone twice her age. She understood not just the legal principles involved, but the strategic importance of projecting confidence and competence. Agent Harrison and his team spent another hour examining documents, taking photographs, and asking questions that Ray answered with helpful cooperation. But underneath the polite exchanges, everyone in the room understood that the power dynamic had shifted fundamentally. The Delaney family owned something the federal government wanted, but couldn't simply take. And after 300 years of careful legal protection, they had the documentation to prove it. After the agents left, Ray sat with his children and Dolores around the kitchen table, surrounded by the papers that had just changed their lives. "Forever. So what happens now?" Marcus asked. Ray looked at the Spanish land grant, at Samuel's carefully preserved documentation, at the compass that had guided 3 centuries of Delaney family destiny. "Now we finish what Alejandro started," he said. "We develop these resources the right way, with respect for the land and consideration for future generations. And we prove that private ownership can serve the public good better than government." "Control," Emma smiled, her expression carrying echoes of both Sarah's determination and Samuel's quiet wisdom. "I think that's exactly what Grandpa Samuel hoped we'd say." The video camera sat on Samuel's old desk, its red recording light casting strange shadows across the walls of the study that had become the nerve center of their operation. Ray adjusted the focus one more time, making sure the image was clear, before settling into the leather chair where his grandfather had spent countless hours planning for this moment. Testing, he said, watching the levels on the small monitor. "Okay, this is working." Behind the camera, Emma and Marcus watched with the kind of focused attention they'd once reserved for Saturday morning cartoons. The discovery of Samuel's final video message had been Emma's idea. She'd been systematically cataloging all of his equipment and found the digital camera hidden in a locked drawer, along with detailed instructions for accessing the files stored. On its memory card, the message was dated 3 days before Samuel's death. Ray pressed play, and suddenly his grandfather was alive again, sitting in the same chair Ray now occupied, looking directly into the camera with eyes that held both wisdom and urgency. "Raymond, if you're watching this, then you've found the Spanish land grant and you understand what it means. You know that our family has protected these mineral deposits for 3 centuries, waiting for the right time and the right person to develop them responsibly." Samuel's recorded voice was stronger than Ray remembered from their childhood meeting, filled with the kind of quiet authority that comes from decades of careful planning. By now, you've probably met with federal agents. They'll try to convince you that national security requires government oversight of strategic mineral resources. They're not entirely wrong. These deposits are strategically important, but they're wrong about who can be trusted to develop them properly. Emma leaned forward, studying her great-grandfather's face on the small screen. Even in the digital recording, Samuel's eyes held the same intense focus that had marked every aspect of his life. I've spent 40 years building relationships with people who can help you succeed where others have failed. Environmental scientists who know how to extract minerals without destroying ecosystems. Engineers who've developed clean processing methods that don't pollute groundwater. Tribal leaders who understand the spiritual significance of the land. Community organizers who can ensure that local people benefit from development instead of being displaced by it. Samuel paused in the recording, looking directly into the camera with an expression that seemed to see across time to this exact moment. But most importantly, Raymond, I've identified the threat you'll face. Not from the government, they'll bluster and posture, but the law is on your side. The real threat will come from your brother Michael. Ray felt cold despite the warm desert. Evening. On screen, Samuel continued with the kind of careful precision that had characterized everything he'd ever done. Mike will see the legal documents and realize what he lost when he dismissed the inheritance as worthless. He'll hire lawyers, challenge your claim to the property, try to prove that the mineral rights should be shared among all of Samuel Delaney's descendants. He'll argue that I was mentally incompetent when I wrote my will, that I was unduly influenced by outside parties, that the inheritance should be invalidated. Emma and Marcus exchanged glances, both remembering their uncle's aggressive visit, and his promises to pick up the pieces when Ray's plans failed. I prepared for this, of course. Samuel continued. The legal documentation is comprehensive. The chain of title is unbroken, and I've had multiple psychiatric evaluations confirming my mental competency right up until my death. But Mike will hire expensive lawyers and file complex lawsuits designed to tie up your inheritance in court for years. Samuel leaned closer to the camera, his expression growing more intense. That's why timing is crucial, Raymond. You have maybe 6 months before Mike's legal challenges can gain traction in the court system. 6 months to prove that you're not just the legal owner of these mineral deposits, but the right owner. The person who can develop them in a way that serves everyone's interests. The recording showed Samuel reaching for something off-camera, then holding up a thick folder of documents. I've negotiated preliminary agreements with 3 different mining companies, all specializing in environmentally sustainable extraction methods. I've obtained conditional environmental impact approvals from both federal and state agencies. I've even secured financing from investors who believe in responsible development of strategic resources. Ray paused the video, looking at his children with amazement. He set up everything, every piece of the puzzle, except the final decision to move forward. Why didn't he just do it himself? Marcus asked. Emma answered before Ray could speak. Because he needed someone younger, someone who would be personally invested in the long-term success of the project, someone who would see this as a beginning, not an ending. Ray resumed the video. Samuel's face filled the screen again, his expression softening with something that might have been grandfatherly pride. I chose you, Raymond, because you understand what it means to lose everything and keep fighting anyway. You've buried a wife, lost a job, faced the possibility of failing your children, and you still had the courage to bring them here and start over. That's the kind of character these mineral deposits require. Someone who thinks beyond immediate profit to long-term responsibility. Samuel reached into his desk drawer and pulled out the brass compass, holding it up to the camera. This compass has guided 5 generations of Delaney men to the same conclusion, that real wealth isn't what you can take from the land, but what you can leave for future generations. Your ancestor Alejandro understood that. Your father never did, but you, I believe you understand it perfectly. The old man set the compass down and picked up what looked like a business card. When you're ready to move forward, call Dr. Sarah Martinez-Chen at the University of Arizona. She's been waiting 20 years for this phone call. Her doctoral thesis was on sustainable rare earth mineral extraction, and she's developed processing methods that could make our deposits profitable while actually improving the local environment. Ray felt a chill of recognition. This was the same Dr. Martinez-Chen that Dolores had mentioned, the environmental engineer who specialized in exactly the kind of work they'd need to develop the deposits responsibly. Sarah has been working with my financial advisors to structure what we're calling the Delaney Community Mining Cooperative. Instead of selling the mineral rights to a corporate mining company, you'll retain ownership while partnering with local communities to share both the work and the profits of extraction. Samuel's recorded image leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Raymond, if you do this right, you won't just make your family wealthy. You'll create a model for how strategic mineral resources can be developed, in a way that strengthens communities instead of destroying them. You'll prove that private ownership and environmental responsibility can work together. And you'll give your children something more valuable than money. You'll give them an example of what it means to be worthy of the gifts they've inherited. The video continued with detailed instructions for accessing Swiss bank accounts Samuel had established, contact information for lawyers and environmental consultants, and specific timelines for moving forward with development before legal challenges could interfere. But it was Samuel's final words that hit Ray with the force of absolute certainty about what he needed to do. Remember, son, your brother will try to convince everyone that you're not qualified to handle this responsibility. He'll point to your lack of education, your blue-collar background, your recent financial struggles. He'll argue that the mineral deposits are too important to be left in the hands of an unemployed mechanic. Samuel's eyes seemed to look directly at Ray across the years between recording and playback. Don't let him make you doubt yourself. The fact that you've worked with your hands, that you understand what it means to fix things instead of throwing them away, that you know the difference between honest work and easy money, those aren't disqualifications. Those are exactly the qualifications these mineral deposits require. The recording ended with Samuel reaching forward to turn off the camera, his final words hanging in the desert air like a benediction. Make me proud, Raymond. Make your children proud. Make the land itself proud of what you choose to do with it. Ray sat in the silence that followed, feeling the weight of 3 centuries of Delaney family expectations settling on his shoulders. But for the first time, since inheriting the ranch, the weight didn't feel crushing. It felt like armor. Emma was the first to speak. Dad, we need to call Dr. Martinez-Chen tonight. And we need to accelerate our timeline, Marcus added, showing a strategic thinking that reminded Ray painfully of Sarah. If Uncle Mike is going to challenge our legal claim, we need to be in production before he can stop us. Ray picked up the compass, watching its needle point steadily toward the mineral deposits that could transform their lives and their community. Then we better get started. The next morning brought a flurry of activity that would have been impossible without Samuel's decades of preparation. Dr. Sarah Martinez-Chen arrived before dawn, driving a truck loaded with geological survey equipment and accompanied by a team of graduate students who looked like they'd been preparing for this moment their entire academic careers. Sarah herself was nothing like Ray had expected. Compact and energetic, with grey-streaked hair and hands that showed evidence of fieldwork, she moved around the property with the kind of focused intensity Ray recognized from his best mechanics, people who understood complex systems and knew how to make them work. Your grandfather was a remarkable man, she told Ray, as they stood beside the old well that would serve as the primary access point for their survey work. He understood that environmental protection and resource development don't have to be opposing forces. They can be complementary if you're willing to take the time to do things right. Emma had appointed herself as liaison between the family and the technical team, and Ray watched with growing pride as she asked intelligent questions about extraction, methods, environmental safeguards, and community impact assessments. "Dr. Martinez Chen," Emma said, "Samuel's records suggest the mineral deposits extend across most of our property. How do we develop them without disrupting the desert ecosystem?" Sarah smiled, clearly impressed by the 16-year-old's grasp of the issues involved. "That's exactly the right question. Traditional mining destroys habitat and pollutes groundwater. But new techniques allow us to extract minerals through small, targeted boreholes that leave the surface ecosystem intact." She showed them equipment that looked more like precision medical instruments than mining tools, devices that could extract ore samples from specific depths without disturbing the soil above them. Marcus, meanwhile, had discovered that he had a natural aptitude for the technical aspects of surveying work. Within hours, he was helping the graduate students operate ground-penetrating radar equipment and interpret the data it produced. "Dad," he called out from across the survey area, "you need to see this. The mineral deposits are exactly where Grandpa." Samuel's maps said they'd be, but they're bigger than anyone expected. Ray joined his son beside a computer monitor displaying three-dimensional images of the underground formations. The rare earth mineral veins extended like a vast underground root system, connecting deposits across their entire 640-acre property. Conservative estimates based on this data suggest recoverable reserves of over 5 million ounces, Dr. Martinez Chen explained. At current market prices, that's a billion-dollar operation. Ray felt the world shift around him again, the magnitude of their inheritance becoming clear for the first time. But with the wealth came responsibility to the land, to the community, to future generations who would inherit whatever they chose to create here. "Sarah," he said, "assuming we can extract these minerals responsibly, what happens to the local community? How do we make sure our success doesn't become their displacement?" Her answer showed why Samuel had trusted her with his life's work. "We make them partners, not employees. The Delaney Community Mining Cooperative will be owned by your family, but operated in partnership with local tribes, environmental groups, and community organizations. Profits get shared, jobs go to local residents, and environmental restoration becomes part of the extraction process." As the sun set over their first day of professional surveying, Ray gathered his family and advisors around the kitchen table, where Samuel's maps still covered every available surface. The preliminary survey results confirmed everything Samuel had documented over 40 years of patient investigation, but it was the legal document that Dr. Martinez Chen had brought that would determine whether they could move forward with development. "This is a preliminary injunction filed by Michael Delaney this morning in federal court," she explained, setting the legal papers on the table. "He's claiming that Samuel was mentally incompetent when he wrote his will, that the mineral rights should be shared among all descendants, and that development should be halted pending a complete legal review." Ray read the document carefully, noting the expensive law firm representing Mike and the comprehensive nature of their legal challenge. His brother hadn't been bluffing about hiring the best lawyers money could buy. "How long before this affects our ability to proceed?" Ray asked. "Maybe 2 months before they can get a restraining order that would stop all development activity. But if we can begin extraction and prove that we're operating responsibly, the legal landscape changes completely." Emma looked up from her own copy of the injunction. "Dad, we need to accelerate everything. Surveying, environmental approvals, equipment installation, the first extraction operations. If we can produce our first shipment of rare earth minerals before Uncle Mike's lawyers can stop us, we establish our legitimacy as the rightful developers." Ray felt Samuel's dog tags against his chest, drawing strength from the knowledge that the old man had anticipated this exact scenario and prepared accordingly. Then we better get to work. The federal courthouse in Phoenix felt like a cathedral of justice, its marble floors and soaring ceilings designed to remind visitors that they stood in the presence of something larger than themselves. Ray straightened his tie, the first time he'd worn one since Sarah's funeral, and checked his watch. In 30 minutes, a federal judge would decide whether the Delaney family could proceed with developing the mineral deposits that had been protected by their ancestors for 3 centuries. Emma sat beside him on the wooden bench outside the courtroom, her hands folded calmly in her lap, but her eyes bright with the kind of focused intensity Ray had learned to recognize as her mother's fighting spirit. She wore her best dress and carried a leather portfolio containing documents that could change the course of American energy policy. Marcus had wanted to come, but Ray had decided that a 12-year-old boy shouldn't have to watch his family's future decided by lawyers and judges. Instead, Marcus was back at the ranch with Dolores, continuing the surveying work that had become increasingly urgent as Mike's legal challenges escalated. The courtroom doors opened, and Mike emerged surrounded by a phalanx of expensive suits. Corporate lawyers who specialized in mineral rights litigation and moved with the predatory confidence of people accustomed to winning. Mike himself looked uncomfortable in their company, but determined in a way Ray hadn't seen since they were children, fighting over baseball cards. Ray. Mike's greeting was stiff, formal, stripped of any pretense of brotherly affection. Mike. They stood in the courthouse hallway, 2 middle-aged men whose lives had taken such different paths that they might as well have been strangers. Mike, in his perfectly tailored suit and Italian leather shoes, surrounded by legal advisors who charged more per hour than Ray used to make in a week. Ray, in his one good suit from JCPenney, accompanied by his 16-year-old daughter and a folder of 300-year-old documents. "You know this doesn't have to be adversarial," Mike said, his voice carrying the practiced reasonableness of a man accustomed to getting his way through negotiation. "We're family. We should be working together, not fighting in court." "Then, why did you file an injunction to stop our mineral extraction?" Emma asked, her voice level but challenging. Mike's lawyer, a sharp-faced woman in an expensive suit, stepped forward with the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ms. Delaney, your father has undertaken a complex mining operation without proper legal review of the inheritance claim. We're simply ensuring that all interested parties receive fair consideration." Ray felt anger building in his chest, but Emma's calm response reminded him that they'd prepared for this moment. All interested parties received proper notification. "According to Arizona inheritance law," Emma replied, "the mineral rights were specifically bequeathed to Raymond Delaney by Samuel Delaney's legally executed will, witnessed by 2 attorneys and notarized according to state requirements." The lawyer's smile tightened slightly. Nevertheless, the complexity of the mineral rights claims and the strategic importance of the resources in question require federal oversight. "Since when," Ray asked quietly, "does federal oversight supersede private property rights established by royal grant of the Spanish crown and continuously maintained under Mexican and American law for 3 centuries?" Before Mike's lawyer could respond, the courtroom doors opened and a bailiff announced that Judge Patricia Williams was ready to hear arguments in the case of Michael Delaney versus Raymond Delaney regarding the mineral rights to the Delaney Ranch property. The next 2 hours were a masterclass in legal strategy and the power of careful preparation. Mike's lawyers presented their case with professional competence, arguing that the mineral deposits were too strategically important to be developed by a single individual without proper oversight, that Samuel's will should be invalidated due to questions about his mental competency, and that the inheritance should be distributed equally among all of Samuel's descendants. But it was Emma who provided the moment that changed everything. Judge Williams had been reviewing the Spanish land grant with obvious skepticism, clearly. wondering whether a 300-year-old document could have any relevance to modern mineral rights law. Mike's lawyers sensed an opening and began arguing that colonial-era grants couldn't possibly supersede contemporary federal authority over strategic resources. That's when Emma stood up. "Your Honor, may I address the court?" Judge Williams looked surprised. "Young lady, are you representing your father in this matter?" "No, Your Honor, but I am a direct descendant of Alejandro Delaney, the original grantee, and I have something the court needs to see." Emma opened her portfolio and removed a document that made everyone in the courtroom lean forward. Not the Spanish land grant, they'd already examined that, but a letter written in English on official U.S. government letterhead dated 1962. "Your Honor, this is correspondence between Samuel Delaney and the U.S. Department of Interior, acknowledging federal recognition of the Delaney family's mineral rights and specifically noting that those rights predate federal authority and are protected under the constitutional guarantee of private property rights." Judge Williams took the letter, reading it carefully while the courtroom waited in tense silence. "Mr. Delaney," she said to Ray, "this letter appears to confirm that the federal government has already reviewed and accepted your family's claim to these mineral rights. Were opposing counsel aware of this correspondence?" Mike's lawyers exchanged glances, clearly caught off guard by evidence they hadn't expected. "Your Honor," the lead lawyer began, "federal policy regarding strategic mineral resources has evolved significantly since 1962. Has it evolved enough to override constitutional protections of private property rights?" Judge Williams interrupted. "Because this letter, signed by a federal district court judge, explicitly states that the Delaney mineral rights are legally established and federally recognized." Emma wasn't finished. She pulled out another document. A partnership agreement that Dr. Martinez Chen had helped them negotiate with local tribes and environmental groups. "Your Honor, the plaintiffs have argued that these mineral deposits are too important to be developed by private owners. But the Delaney Community Mining Cooperative demonstrates that private ownership can serve public interests more effectively than government control." She handed the partnership agreement to Judge Williams, her voice growing stronger with each sentence. "This agreement establishes profit sharing with local communities, environmental restoration as part of the extraction process, and priority hiring for local residents. It creates jobs, protects habitat, and ensures that the wealth generated by these resources benefits everyone, not just corporate shareholders." Judge Williams studied the partnership agreement, clearly impressed by its comprehensive approach to balancing private profit with community benefit. "Miss Delaney, this is remarkably sophisticated planning for someone your age." "Thank you, Your Honor, but the planning wasn't mine. It was my great-grandfather's. Samuel Delaney spent 40 years preparing for responsible development of these resources, building relationships with environmental scientists, tribal leaders, and community organizations. The partnership agreement represents decades of careful collaboration. Mike's lawyers requested a recess to review the new evidence, but Judge Williams had heard enough. "Gentlemen, I've reviewed the legal precedents, examined the historical documentation, and considered the arguments presented by both parties. The Delaney family's claim to the mineral rights in question is legally established through continuous ownership dating back to Spanish colonial grants. Federal recognition of these rights is documented and confirmed. Most importantly, the partnership agreement demonstrates that private development can serve public interests more comprehensively than federal control." She paused, looking directly at Mike. "Mr. Michael Delaney, while I understand your concern about being excluded from what appears to be a valuable inheritance law is clear. Property passes according to the wishes of the deceased, as expressed in a legally executed will. Samuel Delaney's will is unambiguous in granting these mineral rights specifically to Raymond Delaney." Ray felt something that might have been relief washing over him, but Judge Williams wasn't finished. However, this court is also concerned about the environmental and community impact of large-scale mineral extraction. Therefore, I'm granting conditional approval for the Delaney Community Mining Cooperative to proceed with development, subject to quarterly environmental reviews and community impact assessments. She looked at Emma with something that might have been admiration. Miss Delaney, your partnership agreement addresses most of the court's concerns about responsible development. I am particularly impressed by the profit-sharing provisions and environmental restoration requirements. If private mineral development can serve as a model for community-centered resource extraction, this project could have implications far beyond your family's property. As they left the courthouse, Ray felt Samuel's dog tags against his chest and thought about the conversation they'd had 40 years ago, when Ray was 8 years old and visiting the ranch for the first and only time before today. Samuel had shown him the desert, pointed to the mountains, and said something Ray had never forgotten. Sometimes, Raymond, a man's greatest responsibility isn't what he takes from the land, but what he leaves for the people who come after him. Now walking out of federal court with his daughter beside him and a legal victory that secured their family's future for generations, Ray finally understood what his grandfather had been trying to teach him. The signed mining contract lay on Samuel's old kitchen table like a bridge between past and future, its pages heavy with the weight of 3 centuries of Delaney family dreams finally coming to fruition. Ray set down his pen and looked around the room that had become the headquarters of the most ambitious, sustainable mining operation in American history. Dr. Sarah Martinez Chen sat across from him, her laptop displaying real-time data from the extraction equipment that had been operating for 3 weeks. The numbers were extraordinary by any measure: mineral purity exceeding projections by 15%, environmental impact below permitted thresholds, and community support growing stronger each day as local residents saw the tangible benefits of their partnership with the Delaney family. $300 million in confirmed reserves, Sarah said, her voice carrying a note of amazement that hadn't diminished despite weeks of similar revelations. And that's just from the initial survey area. The geological formations extend much deeper than Samuel's original mapping suggested. Emma looked up from her own laptop, where she'd been coordinating the logistics of their first commercial shipment with buyers in California and Texas. At 17, her birthday had passed during the busy weeks of equipment installation, she'd developed an intuitive understanding of rare earth mineral markets that impressed even veteran traders. The renewable energy companies are competing for our entire output, she reported. Solar panel manufacturers, wind turbine producers, electric vehicle battery makers, everyone wants sustainably extracted rare earth elements. And we're the only operation that can guarantee environmental responsibility throughout the extraction process. Marcus burst through the front door with the kind of excited energy that had become his trademark since discovering his natural aptitude for the technical aspects of mining operations. At 13, he could operate geological survey equipment with the competence of graduate students and had developed modifications to their extraction processes that improved efficiency by 12%. Dad, the first production run is complete. Dr. Martinez Chen, you need to see the purity analysis. He handed over a data tablet showing laboratory results that made everyone in the room stop what they were doing. The rare earth minerals they'd extracted weren't just meeting commercial standards. They were exceeding the purity levels of anything currently available on the global market. 97% purity, Ray read aloud. Sarah, is that unusual? Unusual? Sarah laughed, the kind of delighted surprise that comes from scientific discoveries that exceed all expectations. Ray, most rare earth operations struggle to achieve 80% purity with complex chemical processing. You're producing 97% pure minerals using extraction methods that actually improve soil quality. The success had come at a cost, though. The past 3 weeks had been a blur of 18-hour days, equipment installation, environmental monitoring, and the constant pressure of Mike's legal challenges, which continued despite his courtroom defeat. Even now, Ray could see dust clouds on the horizon that probably meant another visit from federal inspectors or lawyers representing mining corporations who wanted to buy the Delaney operation or find reasons to shut it down. But it was the knock on the front door that surprised everyone. Ray opened it to find Mike standing on the porch, alone for the first time since the inheritance battle began. No lawyers, no expensive suits, no aggressive energy, just Ray's older brother looking tired and somehow smaller than Ray remembered. "Mike," "Ray, I was wondering if we could talk. Just the two of us." Ray looked back at Emma and Marcus, both of whom nodded encouragingly. Sarah gathered her equipment with diplomatic efficiency, giving the brothers privacy for whatever conversation needed to happen. They walked to the front porch, where Ray had spent so many evenings planning their operation and watching sunsets that had become more beautiful as their future grew more secure. Mike sat heavily in one of Samuel's old wooden chairs, looking out at the desert landscape that had seemed so desolate just months ago. "I was wrong," Mike said finally, "about the land, about Samuel, about what you could accomplish here." Ray didn't respond immediately, letting his brother find whatever words he needed to say. "I drove out here expecting to see environmental destruction, displaced wildlife, maybe some kind of strip mining operation that would justify everything I said about you not being qualified to handle this responsibility." Mike gestured toward the extraction site, barely visible in the distance as a small cluster of equipment and monitoring stations that looked more like a research facility than a mining operation. "Instead, I find the most sophisticated, sustainable mining operation I've ever seen. Equipment I didn't know existed, environmental restoration that's actually improving habitat, profit-sharing agreements that are making this entire region economically viable for the first time in decades." Ray felt some of the tension that had been building between them for months beginning to ease. Samuel spent 40 years preparing for this, Mike. "All we did was follow his plan." "No, that's not all you did." Mike turned to look directly at his brother. "You had the vision to see what Samuel was offering, the courage to risk everything on a possibility most people would have dismissed as impossible, and the wisdom to develop these resources in a way that serves everyone's interests." He paused, seeming to struggle with something. "Ray, I need to apologize. Not just for the legal challenges, but for 40 years of treating you like you weren't smart enough or ambitious enough to accomplish something significant. I was wrong about who you are and what you're capable of." Ray thought about all the times Mike had dismissed his ambitions, questioned his decisions, assumed that his blue-collar background meant limited potential. But looking at his brother now, he saw something he'd missed before. Mike hadn't been protecting him from failure so much as protecting himself from the possibility that there were paths to success he'd never been brave enough to explore. "Mike, you made choices that were right for your family and your situation. There's no shame in choosing security over risk. Maybe not, but there's no glory in it either." Mike smiled ruefully. "Emma's college application essay is getting national attention, did you know that? What I learned from my family's billion-dollar mining operation. Harvard, Stanford, MIT, they're all recruiting her." Ray felt a surge of pride that still surprised him with its intensity. Emma had transformed from a grieving teenager, angry about being dragged to the desert, into a young woman capable of managing complex business operations and speaking confidently to federal judges. The change in both his children over the past 6 months had been the greatest treasure of all, and Marcus is already being courted by engineering programs. At 13, Mike shook his head in amazement. "Ray, your kids aren't just wealthy now. They're accomplished, respected, ready to take on challenges that would intimidate most adults. They've had good teachers," Ray said, thinking of Dr. Martinez Chen, Dolores, and all the experts who had invested time in helping his children understand the complexity of what they'd inherited. Mike was quiet for a long moment, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a legal document. This is a withdrawal of all my legal challenges to your ownership of the mineral rights, signed, notarized, and filed with the federal court this morning. Ray took the document, scanning its formal language acknowledging his exclusive right to the mineral deposits and terminating all claims by other potential heirs. Mike, you didn't have to. Yes, I did. Because I finally understand what Samuel was really doing when he left everything to you. Mike stood up, walking to the porch railing and looking out at the extraction operation that was producing wealth beyond anything their family had ever imagined. He wasn't just giving you mineral rights, Ray. He was giving you the opportunity to prove what kind of man you are when faced with extraordinary responsibility. And you've proven that you're exactly the kind of man these resources deserved. Ray joined his brother at the railing, both of them looking toward the mountains that marked the boundaries of land that had been protected by Delaney men for 300 years. There's something else, Mike said, pulling out a business card. I've been talking to environmental groups, renewable energy companies, even some federal agencies about establishing the Delaney model as a template for sustainable resource development nationwide. Ray looked at the business card. Michael Delaney, consultant, sustainable resource development. You want to help other families develop their mineral resources responsibly? I want to help you expand this operation to other properties, other communities, other opportunities to prove that private ownership and environmental responsibility can work together. Mike smiled, the first genuine smile Ray had seen from his brother in years. Turns out there's a growing market for expertise in sustainable mining operations, and the Delaney Community Mining Cooperative has become the gold standard. Ray felt something that might have been forgiveness, replacing the resentment he'd carried toward his brother for so long. Mike hadn't just withdrawn his legal challenges. He'd found a way to become part of the solution instead of part of the problem. Partners, Mike asked, extending his hand. Ray shook it, feeling the weight of family reconciliation that had seemed impossible just months ago. Partners. As evening fell over the desert, Ray stood on his front porch, with his family gathered around him, Emma and Marcus discussing the technical challenges of their next expansion phase. Mike and Sarah planning a consulting business that could transform mineral development across the American West, and Dolores sharing stories about Samuel's reaction to their success from whatever realm he now inhabited. The compass that had started everything sat on the porch table, its needle pointing steadily toward the extraction site, where lights twinkled like earthbound stars. But Ray no longer needed its guidance. After 6 months of following Samuel's carefully planned path toward responsible wealth, he finally understood what his grandfather had known all along. The real treasure had never been the rare earth minerals buried beneath their feet. It had been the opportunity to discover what the Delaney family was capable of when they stopped running from responsibility and started embracing the gifts they'd been given. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, environmental reviews, equipment, upgrades, expansion planning, and the constant work of proving that sustainable resource development could be both profitable and ethical. But tonight, Ray Delaney sat on his front porch, surrounded by family and friends, watching stars emerge over land that would provide for generations of Delaneys yet unborn, and felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who had finally found his true calling. 1 year later, Ray stood in the doorway of the ranch house that had been transformed from a crumbling relic into the kind of home Sarah would have loved. The sagging porch had been rebuilt with hand-hewn timber, the peeling paint replaced with colors that complemented the desert landscape, and the interior restored with careful attention to preserving Samuel's spirit while creating space for a family's future. The kitchen where they'd first spread Samuel's maps now served as the nerve center for an operation that employed 43 people from the surrounding communities and had become a model for sustainable resource development, studied by universities from MIT to Stanford. Emma's college acceptance letters, she'd chosen environmental engineering at Caltech, were framed on the wall beside Marcus's award for the regional science fair where he'd presented their mineral extraction innovations. But it was the photograph on the mantelpiece that captured the real transformation. A family portrait taken in front of the restored ranch house, showing Ray with his arm around a woman who had brought laughter back into their lives, Emma in her graduation cap and gown, Marcus grinning with the confidence of a young man who'd found his calling, and even Mike, who had become not just a business partner, but a genuine friend and supporter. The woman was Dr. Rebecca Chen, Sarah Martinez Chen's younger sister and a teacher from the local school district who had been quietly volunteering her time to help Marcus and other children in the area understand the scientific principles behind their family's mining operation. What had started as professional collaboration had grown into something neither Ray nor Rebecca had expected to find at this stage of their lives, but which felt as natural as the desert sunrise. "Dad, the delegation from Washington is here," Emma called from the front porch, her voice carrying the calm authority she'd developed while managing community relations for the mining cooperative. Ray straightened his tie. He'd grown comfortable, wearing them for the constant stream of visitors who came to study their operation, and walked to the front door. A convoy of black SUVs was approaching, but these weren't the threatening federal agents who had tried to intimidate them a year ago. These were senators, congressional representatives, and cabinet officials who wanted to understand how the Delaney community mining cooperative had become the most successful, sustainable resource development project in American history. Emma met the delegation with the poise of someone who had given countless presentations to investors, environmental groups, and academic researchers. At 18, she moved between discussions of geological formations, environmental impact assessments, and economic development strategies with the competence of someone twice her age. "Welcome to the Delaney Ranch," she said, shaking hands with senators and cabinet secretaries as naturally as she had once greeted customers at the Phoenix hardware store, where she'd worked part-time before their inheritance changed everything. "My father and our team are looking forward to sharing what we've learned about responsible mineral development." Marcus emerged from the workshop where he'd been demonstrating the equipment modifications that had improved their extraction efficiency by 37% while reducing environmental impact below the levels of undisturbed desert. At 14, he had been accepted into a special program at Arizona State University that would allow him to pursue engineering studies while continuing to work with the mining operation that had become his laboratory. "Senators," Marcus said, his greeting formal but confident, "would you like to see how we've integrated traditional mining techniques with environmental restoration methods?" Ray watched his children handle the delegation with pride that still surprised him with its intensity. These weren't the grieving, angry teenagers he'd dragged to the desert a year ago. These were accomplished young adults who had found purpose and direction through understanding that privilege came with responsibility. Dr. Martinez Chen joined the group, her laptop displaying real-time environmental monitoring data that showed how their mining operations had actually improved soil quality, increased wildlife diversity, and enhanced groundwater purity in the extraction areas. The Delaney model has proven that sustainable resource development isn't just environmentally responsible, she explained to the assembled officials. It's more profitable than traditional methods because it eliminates the long-term costs of environmental remediation and community displacement. Senator Patricia Walsh from the Energy Committee leaned forward with obvious interest. "Dr. Martinez Chen, Our staff analysis suggests that replicating this model on federal lands could reduce American dependence on foreign rare earth minerals by 60% while creating jobs in rural communities. What would be required to scale this operation to other properties? Emma stepped forward with the kind of calm confidence that would serve her well in whatever career she ultimately chose. Senator Walsh, we've been working with my Uncle Mike to develop training programs for other communities interested in sustainable resource development. The key isn't just the technology, it's building the relationships and trust that make community ownership work. Mike appeared from the direction of the extraction site, no longer the aggressive skeptic who had tried to stop their operation, but a consultant whose expertise was increasingly sought by communities across the American West. His reconciliation with Ray had grown into a partnership that leveraged Mike's business experience and Ray's practical wisdom to help other families and communities develop their resources responsibly. Senators, Mike said, joining the group with dusty boots and rolled-up sleeves that showed he'd been doing actual work rather than just talking about it. We've identified 47 properties in 7 states where similar sustainable mining operations could be established. Conservative estimates suggest these developments could generate over 200,000 jobs while producing strategic minerals worth approximately $50 billion. Ray found himself remembering the day Samuel's attorney had delivered news of an inheritance that seemed more burden than blessing. The man standing in his restored ranch house, surrounded by family and friends and visitors who treated him as an expert rather than an unemployed mechanic, bore little resemblance to the broken widower who had driven his children into the desert a year ago. But the real transformation wasn't in his circumstances. It was in his understanding of what it meant to be worthy of the gifts he'd been given. Dolores appeared from the kitchen, carrying a tray of the coffee and pastries that had become a tradition for their official visitors. Luna following behind her with the patient dignity of a horse who had become accustomed to congressional delegations and media attention. At 75, Dolores had become the unofficial historian of their operation and the keeper of Samuel's memory, ensuring that visitors understood the decades of careful planning that had made their success possible. Senators, she said, offering coffee with the kind of gracious hospitality that had helped turn skeptical officials into advocates for their model. Samuel always said that the land would take care of the people who took care of the land. Everything you see here started with that simple idea. As the delegation toured the extraction facilities and environmental restoration areas, Ray found himself walking the familiar path to the old well that had started everything. The compass Samuel had left them now sat in a place of honor in the ranch house. Its needle no longer needed to point toward hidden treasure that had already been found, but the real treasure Ray knew now had never been the rare earth minerals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. It had been the discovery that a broken family could heal itself through shared purpose, that communities could thrive when they controlled their own resources, and that private ownership could serve the public good when guided by wisdom rather than greed. Rebecca found him there, standing beside the well where Samuel had spent 40 years preparing for this moment. She slipped her hand into his with the comfortable intimacy of two people who had found love when they'd stopped looking for it. Regrets? She asked, a question that had become their private joke during the months when their relationship had grown from professional collaboration to personal commitment. Only that Samuel didn't live to see it, Ray replied, the same answer he always gave. He saw it, Rebecca said, gesturing toward the extraction site where lights twinkled in the gathering dusk and the sounds of sustainable prosperity echoed across the desert. Maybe not with his eyes, but he saw it. Every survey, every map, every relationship he built was him seeing this exact future. Emma appeared at Ray's elbow, having left the congressional delegation in Marcus's capable hands. while she sought out the quiet moment she'd learned to recognize as her father's need to process the magnitude of what they'd accomplished. "Dad, Senator Walsh wants to know if you'd be willing to testify before Congress about sustainable mining legislation." Ray thought about the unemployed mechanic who had inherited a crumbling ranch and a mysterious compass, then looked at his daughter, who could address senators with confidence, and his son, who was revolutionizing extraction technology at 14, and felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who had finally understood his purpose in life. "Tell the senator I'd be honored to share what we've learned." As they walked back toward the house, where light spilled from windows that had once been boarded up, and voices of important visitors mixed with the laughter of children from the community school that now used their ranch as an outdoor laboratory, Ray felt Samuel's presence as clearly as if the old man were walking beside them. The letter Samuel had left him talked about looking deeper than the surface, about understanding the true value of the land and its possibilities. But Ray understood now that Samuel hadn't just been talking about mineral deposits. He'd been talking about the possibility that a family broken by loss could rebuild itself through shared purpose, that a community struggling with economic decline could find new prosperity through cooperative ownership, and that the American dream of private property and individual achievement could evolve to serve collective good without sacrificing personal responsibility. The congressional delegation stayed until well past sunset, asking detailed questions about extraction methods, environmental safeguards, profit-sharing agreements, and community impact assessments. But it was Marcus who provided the moment that would be remembered in committee hearings and policy papers for years to come. "Senator Walsh," the 14-year-old said, with the quiet confidence of someone who had found his calling, "the most important thing we've learned is that sustainable development isn't just about protecting the environment. It's about creating systems that can last for generations. Everything we do here is designed to be just as profitable and environmentally sound 50 years from now as it is today." Ray watched the senators and cabinet officials nod with the kind of respect usually reserved for experts twice Marcus's age, and felt the pride that had become his constant companion over the past year. His children hadn't just inherited wealth, they'd inherited wisdom, responsibility, and the knowledge that true success comes from leaving the world better than you found it. As the delegation finally departed, promising to introduce legislation that would encourage sustainable mining operations on both private and public lands, Ray gathered his extended family on the front porch where so many crucial conversations had taken place over the past year. Emma was reviewing college course catalogs with the focused intensity of someone who had found her life's work in environmental engineering. Marcus was sketching improvements to their extraction equipment with the innovative spirit that had already resulted in 3 patent applications. Mike was planning a consulting trip to Montana, where ranching families wanted to explore sustainable development of their mineral resources. Dr. Martinez Chen was analyzing data from their latest environmental surveys, which showed continued improvement in local ecosystem health. Rebecca was working on lesson plans that would help elementary students understand the scientific principles behind renewable energy and sustainable resource development. And Dolores was simply watching with the serene satisfaction of someone who had seen a lifetime of careful planning come to fruition. "You know what Sarah would say if she could see us now?" Ray asked, the question directed to his children, but meant for everyone who had become part of their extended family. "That the biggest risk is not taking any risk at all," Emma replied, with a smile that held echoes of her mother's spirit, "and that nothing important was ever discovered by people who were afraid to look foolish," Marcus added, remembering the woman who had taught him that curiosity was more valuable than caution. Ray picked up Samuel's compass from the porch table, its brass surface worn smooth by generations of Delaney hands. The needle still pointed toward the extraction site where sustainable prosperity continued around the clock. but Ray no longer needed its guidance. After a year of following his grandfather's carefully planned path toward responsible wealth, he had internalized the wisdom Samuel had spent 40 years trying to pass on. "Your great-grandfather left us more than mineral deposits," he told his children, as stars emerged over land that would provide for generations of Delaneys yet unborn. "He left us an example of what it means to think beyond your own lifetime, to plan for people you'll never meet, to use whatever gifts you've been given in service of something larger than yourself." Emma leaned against her father's shoulder with the comfortable affection of a young woman who had found her place in the world through understanding that privilege came with responsibility. "Dad, do you think we've proven ourselves worthy of what Grandpa Samuel left us?" Ray looked out at the lights of the extraction operation that employed dozens of local residents, the workshop where Marcus was developing innovations that would benefit sustainable mining operations worldwide. The restored ranch house that had become a symbol of what was possible when families committed themselves to building rather than consuming, and the desert landscape that was healthier now than it had been before their mining operations began. "I think," he said, feeling the weight of Samuel's dog tags against his chest and the warmth of his extended family gathered around him, "that we've just gotten started." The compass needle trembled slightly in the desert breeze, pointing steadily toward a future that held possibilities none of them could yet imagine, but all of them were prepared to embrace with the wisdom, courage, and determination that had become the true legacy of the Delaney family's 300-year stewardship of the land they now called home.